folks. Thanks for dropping by my little TI-99 themed neck of the woods for a look at 12 of the best cancelled games for TI-99. Games that we now know lived up to the hype, despite their being cancelled, because they survived some way or other so we can play them today. Games like A Magic's Wing War, where you're a dragon exploring a big multi-screen world of deep caverns and open skies. And Lasso, where you're a cowboy capturing cattle and sheep and trying to get the barnyard under control. And Fantasy, where you fight pirates and avoid wild beasts on your way to saving the girl. None of those games ever actually hit store shelves, alas. But they all survived anyway, so for those of us who enjoy them, we can make all the copies we want today. And heck, sometimes even packaging and manual materials too, for that full retail feel. So lucky for us, nobody in the business world really cares about lost TI game IP, and we can preserve it pretty freely. It'd be a shame if we couldn't, given the huge role cancelled games play in the TI library. Mainly just due to the way TI took it off the market as third-party development was really gaining steam, and the library was starting to fill out. The last few months of TI software development in 1983 added a pile of great new titles to the system's library. But with things screeching to a halt at the end of the year, what happened to them varies quite a bit, with some of them making it to retail, but just barely. Some of them making it into production, but never getting mainstream distribution. Then finally, some of them surviving as prototypes or files on disk. And it's that last category I'm looking at today. Games we got in the long run, even though they never hit shelves at your local Toys R Us. Which is a pretty large category, so I've cut the list down to the 12 I think are the most interesting and the most worth playing, now that they're available to anyone via the web. So, let's start from the bottom and work our way up, with the worst of the best of the TI prototype titles. Not the worst of the worst, mind you. This is still a top 12, and there are plenty other protos out there that get left off this list for being less interesting or worthwhile or playable. Either because they're just too broken and incomplete, like Mouse Attack here is, or because they don't really contribute anything unique to the system, like TI's E.T. the Extraterrestrial here, which E.T. branding aside, is just a straightforward no-frills Frogger clone. Or because, in my opinion, they're not as playable as the other ones on this list, like Schnozola here, which is a mix of Cubert and Crystal Castles, but not nearly as enjoyable as either of those games is for me. So on my list of unreleased TI-99 titles that are worth your while, I'm starting at number 12, which is a little-known title, even as unreleased TI games go, called Canonball Blitz, a Donkey Kong clone which otherwise saw versions for Apple II and VIC-20. And the graphics are nothing amazing here, but the game plays well, with the levels imitating ones from Donkey Kong pretty closely, while adding something a little different by making cannonball projectiles your main threat. The game's author is James G. Landowski, who's otherwise known for porting Centipede and Dig Dug to the TI-99. He does good work here, too, and presumably on behalf of the folks who brought Canonball Blitz to market in the first place, Sierra Online. When it comes down to it, Canonball Blitz is exactly what it says on the tin. It's a well-made Donkey Kong clone with a few changes to make it more than just a straight port. It's a game that makes this list by being good at what it does and delivering a well-balanced, pretty tough challenge that'll probably have you working away at mastering it for quite a while. You could, of course, just play the Atari Soft TI Donkey Kong port, And I'm sure some folks will see that as the preferable option as far as Donkey Kong style gameplay on the system goes, since it really is a good port. Personally though, I do like my oddball little known TI spin-offs. Games that feel like they belong on the orphan system that is the TI-99. And Canonball Blitz fits that bill, as does the next game on my list, Lasso from SNK. Lasso is one of 3 games developed for TI-99 based on early SNK arcade games. And all of those games were TI exclusives, making Lasso not just a unique design, but one unique to TI. In the game, you're a cowboy running around a barnyard rounding up livestock with your lasso. You gotta time your throws to capture animals and avoid getting run over while you do it. So the concept is simple but fun, and it fits the TI-99 pretty well, as the only Texas-themed home computer of the 1980s. Now the game absolutely has its flaws. Your lasso fires off pretty darn slow, so catching your sheep and cattle accurately is a little trickier than maybe it should be. Plus, your gunshots move so slowly it's downright hilarious. But in defense of the TI version, things are pretty leisurely in the arcade game too. So the developers on the TI port weren't just out of their minds. The game's action has a slower pace to it by design. Gameplay aside though, as far as the cowboy theme goes, the speech samples here are great at selling that.
Oh no, the sheep busted out.
And I love a game with good speech.
Yeehaw!
So that's inclined to win me over almost on its own.
Uh-oh, I'm a goner.
As an SNK arcade game ported to TI-99 and to nothing else at all on the home market, Lasso is a pretty cool piece of gaming history to have on our TI-99s. But in the end, it is a port instead of an original design. So the game at number 10 on my list, just ahead of it, ends up ahead of it in part by being an original TI exclusive and an original TI design. That being Cave Creatures from Funware. This is one of the final games from Funware and never reached the retail market, which is too bad because it's one of Funware's best games and coolest designs. In Cave Creatures, your job is to shoot down all the creatures while avoiding the enemy ships and ghosts that come your way. And these ghosts are the major catch. Destroying creatures can leave behind eggs that spawn them. So killing creatures is a double-edged sword. It's both your main focus and your main threat. The creatures are the visual focus of the game too, bitmapped as they are in rainbow colors. Pattern updates move them along a path, but since palette values don't move with them, rainbow patterns strobe across their bodies as they move for a cool effect built out of that limitation. Cave Creatures survived as one of a few Funware titles picked up by the failed Romox EC-PC platform, which wanted to make things easier for early 80s retailers by letting buyers write game carts on demand in-store. And while that didn't work out, it did help preserve a few TI games. Cave Creatures, to me, comes off as a mix of Asteroids and Centipede, which is different enough from either of those that it might as well just be an original design. And that originality is a good part of how it gets into my top 12 here. Originality isn't everything, though, or this list wouldn't have started with a Donkey Kong clone. Sometimes you do just want a really good game in a hot genre of the day. And Galaxian-style shooters were pretty hot in the early 80s. Which is why the next game on my list, at number 9, is Astro Fighter, a good Galaxian-style shooter from Data East. This is another case of a little-known arcade game that only ever got ported to TI-99. and it added something pretty unique to the library at the time. Or it would have, anyway, if it released. Sure, the scrolling's chunky, but 9918 scrolling usually is. More importantly, though, where gameplay's concerned, enemy designs have plenty of variety to them, and their movement patterns are a serious challenge. The level structure has you fight through wave after wave of increasingly hard-to-hit enemies that dive-bomb you quicker and quicker as levels advance with more and more unpredictable patterns. Plus, it's all a race against time, since you've got limited fuel. So that forces you to make tighter, riskier attacks to kill enemies quicker and get to the final level with fuel in your tank. If you survive, you'll reach the enemy mothership and attack. And if you destroy it, you can finally refuel and continue on from there. Astro Fighters occupies that Galaxian-flavored middle ground between Space Invaders on the one hand, and vertical-scrolling shooters we'd get later on the other. It's one step beyond what TI Invaders gave us. But it's still a long way from what Warzone 2 managed to do on the TI in 1989. So yeah, Astro Fighter is not a modern-style vertical-scrolling shooter. But lucky for us, Data East developed a second TI arcade port just around the same time that took vertical scrolling a little more seriously. And that was Mission X. Just like in Astro Fighter, we've got chunky scrolling here, of course. But, as you can see, we've got gameplay where the background isn't just decoration. It's the main attraction, where ships and land enemies on that background are most of your targets. And just to keep things interesting, you've also got to hit a few airborne enemies with your guns. But bombing ground enemies is always your main objective in Mission X. You use both weapons with the fire button, and the game just decides which attack you want based on context. If there's a plane attacking, clearly you want guns. If there isn't, well, you want bombs. And the game knows that, so it gives you what you need. Out of those two enemy types, targets below you and their projectiles are definitely your main threat, so you'll find yourself falling into a few natural attack patterns to avoid them. Firing, then strafing past them, or aiming, then firing, then breaking away. And I find those attack patterns fairly simple, but quite satisfying on the whole. Like Astro Fighter, Mission X was a little-known game for the Deco cassette system. So we're keeping up that trend of obscure arcade games ending up as unreleased carts for TI-99. And we're not even done with that trend yet, because SNK's Fantasy, at number 7 on my list, is yet another one. Fantasy is a game that appeals to me for one key reason that's honestly pretty damn silly. And that is, I love games from this era that instead of doing one design well and really nailing it, cram a whole pile of different designs into the same game. Which, well, Fantasy definitely does. It's kind of a series of small games, where you start out dodging cannon fire to make it to a pirate ship, then you fight some pirates on board the ship, then your bride is whisked away, and you have to fly through the air dodging enemies to get to the heart of the jungle. And finally, once you've gotten there, you have to ascend the jungle maze to save the girl. So Fantasy is an adventure that's pretty big on setting, which I absolutely do appreciate. And it even reinforces that with a bit of voice acting.
Help! Help!
Lift off.
Help me!
The funniest case of that being the lion's roar on the final level, which just leaves you shaking in your boots, doesn't it? Personally, I'd say the jungle is the most impressive of the 4 levels, with a fast scroll going on there, and enemy and obstacle patterns that have you working hard to find a safe route to sneak past with just a few pixels to spare. But once you get past that, the jungle maze is pretty tricky too.
Help me.
So it's a good thing that from the title screen you can start on any level you like, which gives you a nice opportunity to get the hang of those tougher levels, without having to start from level 1 every time.
Help me.
Fantasy absolutely gets points for style, but gameplay-wise, it can be a bit rough around the edges at times. Partly, well, it's a proto. But partly, it's also trying to do 4 things where other games are trying to do just 1. So, while variety's nice, I figure it's no surprise it's the only game on my list trying to do so many things in a single game. And it's no surprise the game ahead of it on this list, Starship Pegasus at number 6, isn't just a single design, it's a single screen game. Starship Pegasus was an unreleased game developed for the Milton Bradley MBX peripheral, and compared to Fantasy, it has a way simpler and more focused approach to what it's trying to do. As an MBX title, this one is pretty obscure, given the MBX hardware itself only barely released at all, with under 1,000 making it out the door. Happily, Starship Pegasus is an MBX game that doesn't actually need the MBX hardware, and plays fine on an unexpanded TI-99, so nowadays it's available to anyone. The way the game controls is pretty unique, in that using the joystick you can fire the cannon on any of the 4 sides of your starship, but once you've fired the projectile, you've now got joystick control over its path, and you got it up and down, or left and right, as the case may be. So as much as this game really amounts to firing and hitting targets one at a time, the mechanics are subtle enough, with enough going on around you, that it keeps you racing to keep ahead of the game. I've got to wonder if the way you guide projectiles was meant for the analog MBX joystick. But in this prototype we have, the MBX joystick doesn't function, and no MBX functions get used. So, TI joystick it is. That's all the better for those looking to play it nowadays though, since there are likely only a couple hundred working MBXs out there, and no emulation for the system. If an MBX game like this one is going to be enjoyed today, not actually requiring an MBX certainly helps, and prevents it from ending up like Championship Baseball, the best TI-99 sports game almost nobody can play, given almost nobody has the hardware.
Right.
Anyway, moving on to our next game at number 5, we've got another game with a pretty simple single-screen design that delivers some great gameplay nonetheless. And that is Superstorm from Atari Soft. A cool little action puzzler, where your goal is to fight back the tide of slime pouring down onto you. Slime was the title of the game on the Atari 8-bit, so no word on how that ended up as Superstorm in the TI-99 port, but so it goes. And while the Atari 8-bit version got just middling reviews, I'm really pretty fond of the TI one. A caveat here being, you're placing a lot of objects as quickly as you can using joystick or keyboard. And often folks do find that frustrating in an age where we're used to mice as the solution for this kind of control situation. My defense of the joystick option here being, you're mostly placing your barriers on diagonals and on planes, or at least you're trying to. So you actually don't want to put them in an arbitrary place, you mostly want to put them exactly diagonal or exactly adjacent to each other, and an 8-directional controller does exactly that. You could play with a trackball, of course, and we do have one of those on the TI. But for the reasons I mentioned, I don't actually think that makes the game more playable. Played with a joystick, on the other hand, Superstorm is a simple action strategy formula that'll have you improving your play bit by bit in a pretty gratifying way, as you learn effective placements. So, Superstorm is definitely worth a look if you like this kind of action strategy gameplay. And you should probably expect that at this point, given we're just inside the top 5 on my list now. Which means, well, it's mostly must-play territory from here on in. And the next game on that list, at number 4, I consider even more of a must-play these days, naturally, which is going to be Lobster Bay from Funware. If I'd put together this list a few years ago, Lobster Bay would have been nowhere to be found, since we didn't even know it existed. But thankfully, since then, the game has been shared with the community and played by a lot of folks like me who just need to investigate every nook and cranny of the TI game library. And so, it's gotten some of the recognition it deserves as a really unique TI-only game. The design here is a multi-screen level layout where you travel from screen to screen, collecting items and avoiding enemies, using terrain features like platforms and conveyor belts and pipes and stairs to get where you need to go. The pace looks pretty leisurely, but you really do have to plan ahead and find a route that keeps you safe and keeps enemies off your back while you collect treasure. The Defender-style map at the top helps you do that by giving you the lay of the land, so you can plan around what you'll be dealing with and where on any given level. You've got limited oxygen, so time matters, and if you run out of oxygen you'll need to visit your ship for a refill, which is dangerous business since it's right in the middle of the map, and easy to get to not just for you, but for all your enemies too. Between each level, you get a bonus round where you hunt for fish with a spear gun. The goal being to shoot the green fish and avoid all the rest. One touch from any of them and the hunt's over. So, sometimes you'll spend spears just to survive, but a perfect bonus round would see you fire at green enemies only. For me, Lobster Bay is probably the most rewarding native TI platformer of the system's heyday. I really like the pace, where thinking carefully about routing and enemy movement is the biggest part of strategy, and twitch control mostly isn't a focus. So, hooray for games that take it slow, at least some of the time. Give me Lethargic the Hedgehog over this Sonic business, because apparently that's where I am at this point in my life. But seriously, fast action games can be a great time too. And if they weren't, I wouldn't have the next game in my list, at number 3, as Robotron 2084. If Lobster Bay kinda spreads things out and lets you consider your options and your strategies and figure out a route, then Robotron is all the chaos right here, right now! Which, it's nice in its own way. But the burning question anybody's going to ask about a Robotron port is going to be, does it offer 2 joystick control, like the arcade game does, where one joystick controls motion and another controls your direction of fire? And the answer here is, well, kinda, since the original dump doesn't feature 2 joystick control, but TI developer extraordinaire Tercy hacked it into a fixed ROM, which does now give us that feature. So, you've got both options. But as for the game itself, well, what Robotron brings to the table barely needs explanation. Fast, frantic, robot blasting action from start to finish. And while 2 joystick control might be necessary to pass the full arcade Robotron purity test, I think the 1 joystick version plays just fine, personally. And after all, as the original TI-99 prototype, maybe that passes the TI-99 purity test better. But whichever version you play, you should give this game a whirl, absolutely. What Robotron does, it does really well. And what that is really easy to get into and pick up and play with almost no explanation needed. But as I was saying earlier, I have kind of a thing for games that do the opposite of all that. Which is to say, games that instead of implementing just one gameplay hook really well, try to implement as many as possible, and, well, hope things work out for the best. And yeah, my number 2 on this list, Wing War, is a game that doesn't settle for single-screen gameplay or simple gameplay hooks. Like Fantasy, it's an adventure in a much bigger world, but this time in a world you can explore a lot more freely. Wing War takes place in a big multi-screen game world, 5 screens high and 7 screens wide, and there's a lot to be found there, as well as lots of ways to find it. It's a world with open skies above and branching caves below. And even where the world seems to force you down one path, destructible environments mean that a path which doesn't exist can sometimes be created to open a way forward. So the game does have a certain open-endedness to it, but one main goal will always be to find air, water, and fire crystals and combine those in your den to create super crystals, which add to your strength in various ways. Those crystals can be found, created, and combined in more than one way, but mostly you won't just find them lying around, so you'll need to explore and experiment to find them all. And even beyond that, the world has some secrets to discover, with a few rarer treasures hidden here and there, in the sky as well as underground. So in short, Wing War is an open-world action-adventure with joust-style flight mechanics and a lot to be explored and found out and figured out.
Adventures await, Dragon Master.
So if you go in blind, you absolutely won't find everything there is to find on your first play session. But as a Magic's final game on the TI-99, after Super Demon Attack, Microsurgeon, Fathom, and Moonsweeper, and as their most ambitious game, I see it as an enigma worth exploring. Though, for those who want an action-adventure that's, well, just a little less damnably obscure about what the hell it wants you to do, there are other appealing options. And one of those is the game I have at number 1 on my list, Tutankham. It's absolutely a little less interesting than Wing War to me, but what it does really, really well. Which is, offer you an action-adventure maze game where you explore tombs, find keys, collect treasure, and kill enemies as you go. You can only shoot left and right, not up and down, so your routing through the maze is heavily determined by that. And otherwise, by the keys you'll need to find to open doors, and the portals you'll need to use to get from one area to another. The scrolling is chunky again here, as always, but especially in this game, that really doesn't hurt anything. Given first of all, there's a dead zone where the game doesn't scroll in the midsection of the screen, and a lot of the time you'll be moving across that dead zone. And second, anytime you're moving up and down, or just shooting, the screen likewise doesn't need to scroll. If all else fails, on top of your main weapon, you've got flashbangs you can use to clear a screen. But it's worth conserving them, since you don't have many to work with. Tutankham is a really brilliantly made action-adventure romp, so particularly if you haven't played the ColecoVision version, TI Tutankham is a sure thing must-play, which belongs at the top of this list, even above my beloved Wing War. But returning to the bigger picture here, what we've looked at is 12 games that I think are really, really worth playing, and none of them got their intended release. So it really is striking just how many of the high-quality games in the modern TI library are games that never showed up on store shelves. All because TI game development screeched to a halt just as everything was taking off. But now we get to defeat an alien menace in Astro Fighter, and fly a bombing run in Mission X, and explore the sea in Lobster Bay, and uncover secret caverns in Wing War, and fight to save the girl and fantasy, and all else we missed. So I guess things worked out in the end, eh? Hope you enjoyed this, folks. And I hope you enjoy some of the games I've talked about here as much as I do. Do you have a favorite from the ones I talked about? Or, for that matter, is one of your favorite unreleased games one of the ones that didn't make my list? Tell me about it. Have a good one, and see you next time.